Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the launch of the 2022 ACS Rural Shop Report. We're delighted to have you all joining us. We're hoping to be in Parliament and having a nice glass of wine or whatever else in the room in the Houses of Parliament. But sadly, that's not possible for reasons we all understand. But all indications are we'll be able to go back to doing those sorts of events sooner rather than later. But we do have a great lineup to take you through the launch of the report. First up, I'm going to be talking in a moment to Selaine Saxby, MP for North Devon, who's sponsor of this launch and sponsor of the room in Parliament before we had to cancel it. And then we'll hear about the report itself from my colleague, our research executive, Rosie Wiggins. We'll then hear about the life of a rural retailer with Rachael Hockmeyer, a retailer from Lincolnshire. Then we'll hear from some more politicians, Lord Benyon, Minister at Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, and Daniel Zeichner, who is part of the Labour Shadow DEFRA team. And then we'll wrap up the event. So thank you all again very much for joining. Please do ask questions in the chat. I'm legendarily bad at actually managing to ask any of those questions, but I'll do my very best to acknowledge all of them and answer them. If I don't manage to, we will contact you afterwards to address that question. So without any further ado, I want to welcome our first guest, or our first commentator on rural shops, who is Selaine Saxby, MP for North Devon. Welcome, Selaine.
Good afternoon.
And again, thanks very much for joining us and for supporting this launch. Can we start with your constituency, start close to home? Tell us about the constituency and the role that rural shops play in North Devon.
Well, North Devon, as most people know, is quite remote. As my old head teacher where I taught described it, at the top of the country's longest cul-de-sac as you come up the A361. So we have a lot of villages. I think I have 93 in my constituency at the last count. And obviously a lot of those are quite far flung. A third of Exmoor is also in my constituency. So it's a big constituency, and a lot of people live in those rural communities. My largest town is Barnstaple, which is about 35,000, depending on where you draw the boundaries, as it has sort of spread. But I think, it gives an indication that we're not a city-driven community, and we don't have that sort of city to drive into in quite the same way that some of my neighbours do. And therefore, our rural communities do very much rely on their rural shops. And I think we all saw during the pandemic, just actually for me, it was an utter joy walking down the road to go to John's the Deli. I'll give them a free plug in Stowe, to actually be able to go and do my shopping without actually having to go to the supermarket all the time. And I think particularly in the early days of the pandemic, because we are so remote, some of our supermarket shelves were quite bare on occasions actually, and I think the rural shops really were able to fill those gaps and actually help with the whole supply chain getting up to North Devon. That actually at times when I couldn't buy eggs anywhere else, my little deli had loads of them, and the farm shops again also were able to help rural communities, and I think take the pressure off the supermarket. So for those people who that is their main way of shopping, or reliant on other people, because obviously we have a lot of older people in North Devon as well who were terribly concerned at the start of the pandemic, and we had teams of people doing shopping for other people around. It was a fantastic sense of community, and our shops were definitely a part of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if anyone didn't recognise the role that local shops and rural shops in particular played 2 years ago, I think that many of those people certainly appreciate and recognise that role now from what we've experienced in those past couple of years. I'm going to throw a couple of sort of government policies and slogans at you now, and maybe talk about them in terms of rural shops. Firstly, build back better. We hear about coming out of the pandemic and trying to build back something better than we were before as a society, as an economy, or that's what I take it to mean anyway. What does that mean locally? Because there's a Build Back Barnstaple campaign as well in your constituency. So what does all that mean in practice?
I think it's learning from the pandemic. So for me, when I look at levelling up across North Devon, I'm often talking about broadband, and that we're not looking to suddenly put a big road or a railway station through. It's much more about that connectivity, but in our case, it's digital rather than actual physical infrastructure. But linking that sort of into the shops with Barnstaple Build Back Better, I think whilst I know a large number of market towns did do very well, and South Molton seems to have bounced back very quickly post-pandemic, and Ilfracombe, although it doesn't really have a market in the same way, it also has, the smaller town centres have. Barnstaple itself, I think as we headed into the pandemic as a town centre, it was perhaps not suffering the same way that other town centres were, which I often think may well be a reflection on our poor broadband, and that actually we all still had to go to the shops if we wanted to go shopping. But obviously the pandemic really speeded up our relationship with online shopping, and the Barnstaple Town Centre, I think, has had a more difficult time. Whilst we have some lovely shops and some very loyal shoppers and work going on with the Future High Street Fund, I think we do have, like most high streets, a lot of empty units coming out of it. And I think we've also, as a community, recognised that perhaps there were a few issues starting with antisocial behaviour, which we've sort of nipped in the bud. And the fabulous Barnstaple in Bloom team last year really did a lot of work highlighting that some of sort of the common areas perhaps could look a bit tidier, a bit prettier. And it has again been those independent shops in town that have done an awful lot to clear bits outside their shops and put window boxes out, and really to sort of tidy and smarten the town up, because I think we all know, as perhaps retailing changes a little bit, that actually we need our town centres to reflect that people are going there for services as well as shopping, and that it becomes an experience to go to town. And I'm a really big believer in appreciating the beauty of a place. And when we all live somewhere as beautiful as North Devon, our little village shops obviously always look fabulous. I say obviously, but they do always look fabulous in their little village locations. I think it's how do we sort of reflect that in Barnstaple. So for me, it's been about really rallying around the town centre and making people want to come back into town if they've perhaps got out the habit during the pandemic. And so it's been really good to see it quite busy over the Christmas period, but it's really maintaining that momentum during this winter period while we don't have our tourists up with us.
Yeah, market towns are very, very important parts of rural economies, obviously, and it's interesting to see that some of those dynamics around the centres and maybe that sort of destination shopping, obviously because a lot of the shops have been shut for a good part of the last couple of years, but also that move towards online, people getting into the habit of shopping online. And actually, one of the things that Rosie will go into when she talks about the report, I know, is the range of services that we offer in rural shops, and actually particularly deliveries and returns of products ordered online. So as it happens, rural shops almost seem to be getting more relevant to how people are living, including using online shopping. And maybe the model is going to be less going into Barnstaple or other market towns and other centres just to shop, but for that whole experience, and then the rural shops providing those essential services and products and filling in all of those gaps. The second thing on the throat is levelling up, which we hear about a lot, and we're waiting for the white paper on levelling up, and I think we're all very interested to see how that's interpreted in that. What is that? As an MP in the Southwest, what does levelling up mean to you? And are there specific things you think rural shops and other retailers should be looking out from in that white paper when we talk about levelling up?
I think for me in North Devon, levelling up is quite an easy thing to start looking at. Within North Devon, we have the 2 poorest wards in the whole of Devon, and 5 of the 10 most economically vulnerable parts of all of Devon are in my constituency. So therefore, I think whilst we have many fantastic natural resources and some beautiful villages that people perhaps wouldn't associate with having sort of those sort of issues and concerns, there are particular pockets within my constituency that I would really target and look at working with. And the council put together an excellent bid, council officers, for the Levelling Up Fund, which unfortunately was unsuccessful this time around, but we have worked with the department up here and met with them. I met with the council, and we're very optimistic it will be successful next time. And Tourism Minister Nigel Huddleston, it had a tourism element to it, as so much of our economy does, but it was actually very much about linking it within Ilfracombe, sort of linking the town centre back to the harbour and along to the seafront, so that it was much clearer where the shops were and that you could get from the shops to the beach. And so the whole sort of thing worked better together. So I think, there are quite specific plans, but as I've already mentioned, broadband is a big one for us. Our broadband connectivity is very poor. It's an area I continue to work on. And I think, rural shops, I'm sure, will appreciate speeding up their broadband as well as everyone else, particularly now they are doing that bit more delivery. And I think, touching on the points you were making about shopping and the changing nature of town centres, one of the things we've noted in Barnstaple is that the units that are now empty are much bigger than the ones that are empty or were empty in Ilfracombe and South Molton, which has made it much easier for independents to start up new concerns. Whereas in Barnstaple, we've got 3 floors above some of them where there used to be chain stores with big storage facilities upstairs, and so they're much more expensive and much harder And I think there's a real need, and this kind of thing, I'm not sure if it will be in the levelling up paper or the planning paper, but I'm talking a lot to our ministers up here to really try and actually ensure that where we actually look at our town centres, we repurpose them better. So we're able to put more housing, which we're desperately short of, where I am in North Devon, sort of above those shops. So the shops become much smaller units that then have become more appealing for local. Hopefully some of those small retailers that have done well in the villages might want to come into town. We've got a lovely farm shops opened in Barnstaple and down Butchers Road. We've historically had those smaller retailers, but that the units need to be the right size for those businesses to be able to thrive and move into that.
Absolutely, and the cost of fitting out those units and all the risk associated with it. It's a really good point, and this is one of the things we've seen in the last, actually even pre-pandemic, is some very big retailers running big shops, unfortunately going out of business or significantly shrinking, and that's clearly one of the impacts. So I think getting that mix of services, housing, hospitality, public sector, retail, all of that together in centres is the challenge. And I think that rural shops play a really important supporting role in the villages around those town centres.
And what we've seen in town is we have a lovely shop where some of the Croyd crafts people have actually all got together and got a little bit within the shop. So I think these are the sort of initiatives that the council have been working on with the town centre management team. And I think there are real opportunities. I ran an online retailer for 15 years, so I have a little bit of understanding of the retail sector. But really, I think there are opportunities for those rural shops that have done such a fantastic job during the pandemic. I think actually everybody wants a rural shop on their doorstep. So I really hope that there'll be opportunities for them to perhaps look at some of these units, come into town and grow their own businesses as well.
Absolutely, particularly where you found new links with other local suppliers and things like that, and you can really bring in something different into those places. They're really exciting opportunity. So I do want to, a final question is in your role as PPS to DEFRA ministers, and I suppose seeking some reassurance or some sense from you around how rural shops are currently being recognised by government and in government policy. Do you think that all the things we've talked about are well recognised in government?
Well, I think obviously you've got Lord Benyon joining you later, who's a real champion of rural communities, and I think there is a real recognition within the DEFRA team, who are farmers and the ardent environmentalists themselves, the importance of things like food miles. And the joy of rural shops is obviously if you're able to walk to the shop, you're not getting in the car. And if you're working with your local farms as a rural retailer, the product hasn't come far either. And I think, this for us, the joy of Devon is we have such fantastic farmers and fantastic produce, which we're now selling in even more rural shops. And things like some of the initiatives where the farms are actually been selling milk direct to the public themselves and their own farm produce straight onto the public. There was a lovely farm I visited near Georgian, which I was able to walk into and just pull my own pint. And these sort of initiatives are just fantastic.
That's amazing.
Of milk, to clarify, but I wasn't at an illicit party. And it was these initiatives, I think, have really being recognised. And at DEFRA, we're obviously looking now into the National Food Strategy, and food miles are an important part of that. And when we have such nutritious food produced around us, I really hope that we will be able to eat far more Devon food in Devon, and that other rural communities will be able to do the same, and that actually that in itself has a very positive environmental impact just by shopping local, in every sense of the word, where it's produced and where it's sold.
Yeah, absolutely. I might pick it up with Rachel later on, but one of the impacts of the pandemic, when we had such trouble with supply initially, and actually throughout the pandemic, there have for various reasons been issues with supply. One of the things that retailers have done is look to more local suppliers to fill those gaps. Maybe looking to food service wholesalers and food service suppliers, obviously lost that market overnight, but still had that production and that product. And there are some really good relationships have been forged, which are lasting through to now and probably will last well into the future. And that's really based around provenance and local and quality, and all those things. So obviously we'd rather it hadn't happened in this way, but some great things we've taken out of the pandemic in terms of those local supply chains, local economies, and something we want to make sure is really recognised in government.
Definitely, and I think the other, I haven't spoken about fishermen, and I know they've had a really tough time through the pandemic, and there's been some great fishing initiatives set up near us as well, where the Devon and Cornwall Fish Company, just over in Jeffrey Cox's constituency, have set up. They're now supplying all the pubs and restaurants, as well as supplying locally. They opened a shop during the pandemic, which has been so successful. There's always a queue outside of it. They've now taken on apprentices, and again, so we're now able to eat fish that's literally coming out of the sea in front of us, and they're working with other English fish catchers and fishermen around the coast. So I think, I'm sure every community has these stories, but supporting our local fishermen and farmers is one of the great things our local shops have done, and they're now creating their own local shops, which is also a great thing.
Absolutely, it is absolutely fantastic, and a real point of difference, and a real opportunity for stores in those areas. So a number of ways that those stores, those rural stores, have become even more relevant over the past couple of years. So I think we'll talk about some of the challenges as we go through the event, but I think a really positive start in terms of talking about just how relevant local shops are and rural shops are in a constituency like North Devon. Selaine, thank you very much indeed for joining us, and thanks for your support for this event and a number of other initiatives throughout the year.
Thank you, and thank you to all the rural retailers listening in this afternoon.
Thanks, Selaine. Thank you. That was fantastic to hear that perspective from an MP in a rural constituency. Lots of things to pick up there, and I'll pick up on some of that and sum me up, and it might come up in discussion with Rachel later on. But now let's hear about the report itself. Without any further ado, I'm going to pass over to the ACS Research Executive, Rosie Wiggins, to take us through the 2022 Rural Shop Report.
Hi, I'm Rosie Wiggins. I'm the Research Executive at ACS, and I'm going to take you through the 2022 Rural Shop Report. All of this data has been taken from the samples and sources used to put together our local shop report, which you can find on the portal if you want any more information or context on these findings. So some headline figures to start off with. Over the last year, rural convenience stores have achieved £15.8 billion in sales, £3.5 billion in GVA, and provided over 138,000 jobs. We also know that rural stores have invested £195 million in their business over 2021, and that there are a higher proportion of rural shops in Wales than any other part of mainland UK. The vast majority of rural shops are independently owned, and around a fifth of rural shop owners have been in the business for more than 25 years. These are both really worth bearing in mind when we get a little further into the report and see how hard retailers have been working throughout this year. A lot of dedication out to those communities. It's quite an even spread looking at the ages of the retailers as well. We're seeing more and more retailers under 30 in the sector, to the point where we now have as many retailers under 30 as we do retailers who've been in the business for 25 years or more. So looking at locations, half of rural local shops are isolated stores with no other retail or service businesses nearby, and roughly a third are on small parades with fewer than 5 other neighbouring businesses. This is particularly relevant for rural shops because the communities which depend on them are those more isolated, smaller communities, and providing as many services as local shops do is really, really vital in those areas with 5 or few other businesses locally. This is also really key to remember in those levelling up discussions which are happening at the moment, as anything which is designed to benefit rural communities really needs to bear these local shops in mind too. So let's talk more about those communities. Rural shoppers are a pretty balanced split of male and female, and the most popular ways of getting to and from rural local shops is either walking, perhaps for those shops located on smaller parades, or driving to those more isolated stores. We also asked shoppers how far they have to get to travel to their local shop. About a fifth of customers have to travel more than a mile to their local shops, but the most common answer was that their local shop was less than a quarter of a mile away, so well within walking distance. This again shows how valuable those more isolated shops are with fewer neighbouring businesses. Shoppers said if their local shop was no longer there, they would be traveling on average 3.3 miles to find another one, with just under a fifth saying they'd be traveling more than 5 miles. Nationwide, customers said they would be traveling about 1.5 miles to find another shop. So it really does hammer home just how necessary rural local shops are to their communities. If a rural shop disappears, it's much more likely that the customers will have to travel further to find another one. A few more insights into customers here. On average, they are likely to visit their shop 2.5 times a week. It's down slightly on last year, but that is to be expected with fewer restrictions in 2021, just generally more to do. It's quite natural that local shop visits might drop this year. What we're not seeing, however, is a drop in basket spend or size. Those have both increased since our last rural local shop report. Basket size up from 2.6 items to 3, and basket spend from 792 to 872. So customers are visiting less frequently, but buying and spending more in store. And last section on shoppers here, 17% of rural shoppers said that they know the people who work in their local shops very well. 32% said they know them quite well, and 33% said that they might not know them, but they do stop to have a conversation occasionally. Those two on the left there, the very well and the quite well, those are both up on last year. So customers are getting to know the people who work in their local shops more and more every year. So I've already talked a lot about the support and services rural shops provide to their communities. So let's break down exactly what those services are. On the top row, we have mobile phone top-ups, bill payment services, cashback, and free-to-use cash machines. These are all incredibly crucial, particularly in those more isolated areas with fewer neighbouring businesses, much less likely to have a local bank branch, for example. So the fact that local shops are able to provide customers with the ability to access cash or to pay their bills, that is incredibly vital services. On the second row, we start to see the delivery and click and collect options there. Over a quarter of stores are offering local grocery delivery, which I'm sure was such a lifeline to rural communities over the pandemic. We also have just over a fifth of rural shops offering post office services. Again, rural areas less likely to have a post office branch locally, so providing those services is really, really valuable. Moving down the list now, fewer stores offering these, but still very valuable, especially food bank donations. The use of food banks rose throughout the pandemic. More of the general public were unable to work, so donating to food banks is really more valuable than ever. Recycling bins and prescription collections too, again, less likely to be close to a big recycling centre or a pharmacy in rural areas, so really, really useful for shops to provide shoppers with that opportunity to just check more to-do list items off in one trip. We also asked about food services. Rural local shops provide, just under half have a customer-operated coffee machine. We also have stores with food prep areas, food to-go concessions, and a handful of stores who offer microwaves for customers too. One of the biggest ways that retailers can serve their customers is to make their store as accessible for as many as possible. 62% of stores have wheelchair access, 46 have wider aisles in store to accommodate wheelchair users, and around a fifth have hearing aid loops in store as well. We also asked customers which services they find most valuable in stores, and rural customers chose cash machines, post offices, and click and collect services. So worth bearing that in mind throughout this year. Moving on to technology in stores now, just under 3/4 of stores have EPOS, over 40% have a store website, and about a third have Wi-Fi in store. Store Wi-Fi is especially useful if you're using social media, because you can give your customers your details and they can look you up right there and then, rather than getting home and forgetting about it. On the right-hand side there, 53% of stores have community notice boards, really reinforcing that impression that rural shops are a neighbourhood hub, keeping everyone informed about what's going on in their community. Looking at payment methods now, this year for the first time, we're seeing fewer than 100% of stores who accept cash. There are a handful of stores who are now digital payments only. We'll see whether that remains so throughout the year or whether that was a pandemic precaution brought in just for the past couple of years. We're also seeing more stores accept contactless, mobile, and card not present transactions, incredibly helpful for customers who have been sent out shopping by a neighbour who may be isolating or vulnerable. On the right there, we have various energy saving measures for stores trying to be a little bit more eco-friendly, from 40% of rural stores having chiller doors to 5% having solar panels to power parts of their store. Last slide on tech here, we have rural shops' use of social media. Facebook is the most popularly used by just under a half of rural shops, followed by Twitter by about a third, and Instagram not far behind, and 13% are now on TikTok. It's the first time we've asked about TikTok in this survey, and it already seems relatively popular with retailers. We also have some Google Trends data here for convenience stores nationwide. All 5 of those top searches are using the term local shop rather than convenience store, which is great to know to be accessible and discoverable online. So here's a little bit more information about delivery in the rural shop sector. We asked retailers to break down the delivery options which they're offering to customers. Most popular service was delivery offered for customers who phone up and place their order over the phone, followed by delivery specifically for vulnerable customers who may be struggling to get in store in person. We also asked retailers if they add any conditions into their delivery services. At the bottom of the slide there, you can see 73% have no minimum spend, 83% have no delivery charge, and 90% have no premium pricing, all of which really help to keep delivery accessible. Moving on now to some more operational data, more retailers opt to get their products delivered than to pick them up from cash and carry. It's going to be interesting to see how supply chains affect this over the next year. Hard to know what to expect, but as it stands, this is how retailers are telling us they're sourcing their products. Now, looking at additional space in stores, for rural multiples, it's a fairly even spread, but for rural independents, it's much less likely that they will have a lot of extra space. About a quarter of rural independents have no additional space in store whatsoever, and over 50% of the rest have less than 1,000 square foot. It's important to bear in mind when we're thinking about stocking products or storing equipment, that space does fill up really, really fast for rural independents. We also asked retailers how they use online wholesaler platforms. Over half of them order their products or use them to order their products. 38% said they don't really use them at all. And it's a roughly even spread among the rest of those options there, using them for click and collect, comparing prices, or finding out about new product lines. 90% of rural independent retailers operate one store only. Again, worth bearing in mind when considering how much space independent retailers are working with. We also know that 10% of rural independent retailers were working at 70 hours or more throughout the past year, and 42% took no holiday. More and more, we're seeing conversations about well-being and mental health in our sector, rightly so, of course, and those figures are really important to bear in mind in those conversations. Yes, rural retailers are incredibly dedicated to supporting their communities, but it is important to get that mental health balance right. Next, we have opening hours. These have dropped very slightly across the country during the pandemic, and in rural stores, it's no different. Average opening hours saw a very slight dip on last year, but stores are still typically open from around 7 in the morning to around 10 at night, with 10% of rural stores closed on Sundays and 1% being 24/7. In terms of ownership for multiples, around a third own the premises and 2/3 rent, and for independents, that is flipped. So roughly 2/3 own and just over a third rent. And in terms of sales space, it's no surprise here, it looks very similar to the additional space graph. Independents tend to be on the smaller side, with over half having less than 1,000 square foot of sales space, and just 8% being in that larger 2,000 to 3,000 square foot category. Moving on now to look more at retailers and colleagues in local shops, 72% of rural retailers started their business themselves, but there are still a significant amount of family businesses. 28% of retailers inherited their family business, 47% employ at least one family member in store, and 8% are owned by family partnerships. And here, quite similar to the early graph, we have a lot of retailers who are newer to the sector. About a third have been in the sector for 5 years or less, with an extra 20% being here for 10 years or less. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have some very established retailers who have been here for 26 years or more. So a real mix of retailers who have had lifelong careers or who are just starting out. Now looking at colleagues in the rural sector. Rural shops provide almost 140,000 jobs, and colleagues have worked a combined 3.3 million hours over the last year. Slightly more women employed than men, very similar to the national split for that question, and 17% are 16 to 25 years old, so just starting out in the working world, and 9% are over 60. So again, real diversity in age ranges for colleagues. In terms of the average working hours in a week, this has shifted slightly over the course of the pandemic. We've seen fewer colleagues in that 0 to 16 hours category and more in the 17 to 30 hours. So colleagues are picking up more hours. Still not a huge change to the full-time hours, but certainly longer part-time shifts or more part-time shifts within a week. We're also seeing more colleagues who have been in the sector for 10 years or more. Since the 2020 rural report, that figure has gone up by 11%, which I think is a great sign that rural shops provide really stable long-term jobs for colleagues. And we know that on average, it only takes colleagues 13 minutes to get to work. More colleagues drive than walk to work, which makes sense depending on where these rural stores are located. But that average time is still under 15 minutes. So rural shops are providing really, really local, reliable jobs. Finally, on colleagues, almost 70% are satisfied with their job in the sector, and 85% feel secure in their current jobs. So colleagues really do feel like they can depend on their work in rural shops to support them, which is wonderful. We also asked colleagues about their plans for 5 years' time. Majority said they see themselves in the same or a similar role with their current employer. About 20% are looking for a more senior role with their current employer, and 9% see themselves as not working or retired, which is exactly the same percentage as those over 60. So I think that makes perfect sense. Final section from me now. This is a nice one to end on, especially for rural shops. Rural shoppers, when asked which local service or business has the most positive impact on their community, they ranked local shops first above pharmacies, pubs, and cafes. Really wonderful result for all the retailers who have put in so much hard work to support their communities. Local shops also came in second in most essential rural services to have locally, just after pharmacies, which I think makes sense after the 2 years that we've had. And rural shoppers ranked banks as the most wanted service to have locally, which again hammers home how important it is that rural shops are able to provide access to cash, either through cashback or through ATMs. I've talked a lot about retailers contributing to their communities, so have some facts here to demonstrate that for you. 84% of retailers engaged with their community in some way over the past year. The majority did this through charity collection, but we also have supporting community events, taking part in council or business engagement projects, and even local litter picking too. So a whole host of ways in which rural shops contribute to and engage with their communities. And this is translating into real results with customers. 58% said that they've seen the support they provided throughout the pandemic has improved their business's standing in the community. And almost a third of shoppers said that they take community engagement into account when they choose which local businesses to support. So sponsoring those events and taking part in those local projects are boosting support for local shops as well as contributing something positive into the community. And finally, for me, just a few headline figures on community-owned shops. Just over 400 of these across the UK now, supporting 150,000 people in remote rural communities, creating almost 700 jobs and 7,500 volunteer positions. So that is everything from me, a rundown of the Rural Local Shop Report 2022. I'm aware that was a lot of information to receive in around 15 minutes. So if you have any questions, you can find the full report up on the ACS portal, or you can get in touch with me or anyone from the ACS team with any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Rosie. As you say, a lot of information, but brilliantly put across. And hopefully that gives everyone a flavour of the role that rural shops are playing. We've had a couple of questions on the chat about getting more information. I think Steve's put on there a link to the report. And if anyone hasn't got a copy, please contact us and we'll make sure we send across a report. I think also a question on there about how we define rural shops. Well, there are standard definitions of rural, urban and suburban that we use. But actually, what I find more interesting than that is breaking down by looking at what services are around those stores. So there's quite a big difference, I would say, between the offer and the role of a rural store, but in a big village with lots of other services around it, compared to being, totally on their own. And our sector is the ultimate sort of micro market, hyper local business. So many customers come from so close to the stores, and that role that we have very much in those villages and communities that we serve. So yeah, do get in touch if you want the if you want a full copy of the report. And thanks again, Rosie. Just a couple of reflections from me before we try and bring it to life a bit more by talking to Rachel. Sometimes rural shops, I think, are talked about in terms of the past. Sometimes we look back and we think about rural shops, and for whatever reason, people think of them as being a feature of the past. This report shows that they are absolutely a feature of the present, and they are certainly going to be a feature of the future. If you look at all that investment in technology and social media, in the breadth of services on offer, the way that we're actually playing a role in the online shopping world in terms of deliveries and returns and so on. And so I think it really shows the increased relevance that we have in the modern world. So rural shops very much part of the future. So let's look a bit more into the role of a rural shop and take a case study. Rachael Hockmeyer, we're delighted that you've joined us, Rachel, running a rural store in Lincolnshire. And I'd like to kick off by telling us a bit about the store and tell us how do you know it's a rural store, Rachel?
Well, I've actually got a story about that. The reason I know we're rural is I was lucky enough to study human geography at university, and I was taking a rural studies module, and they loaded us onto a bus and took us to meet a rural development officer. And guess where they took me? Home. So I drove straight past my own shop where my parents were still working at the time, and 3 miles up the road to meet the rural development officer in a local village. So I know that we're rural, but we are not completely in the middle of nowhere. Actually, we're on the edge of a market town, and it's a small market town, and there are a lot of villages surrounding it that the town services. It was quite interesting to hear what Selaine was saying about Devon, actually, and how Barnstable's doing compared to some of the other villages and things surrounding it. And we've got so few chain stores in our small market town that actually the problems recently with retail have hardly touched Sleaford, and it's doing quite well, really. There's quite few empty shops because all the shops are small, and there's a lot of services in them that are thriving, really. And I think thriving more so because of what's happened with the pandemic, that people are shopping more locally. So that is different.
Yeah. Tell us about what's the USP of the store. What are you trying to bring customers in on the basis of?
I think, like lots of rural stores, we're trying to be everything to everybody, which isn't that easy. We're a petrol station and a SPAR shop. We've been with SPAR for 10 years now. We've been on our site for 50 years this year, so that'll be a big celebration for us. But since we had a big refit in 2019, we've been concentrating on the two specific customer groups that we know we see a lot of. So we still have a lot of business customers because we still operate a local account system, and we have a lot of fuel card customers. So we're trying to concentrate on those customers. A lot of them have a lot of food to go, coffee, they need services to do with their vehicles. And it's a bit of a generalisation, but a lot of them are men. we do have a lot of white van men, and we're trying to look after them. But also, as our town has grown, what was our site was out of town, it's now on the edge of town, and there's a housing estate opposite us, which is a low-cost housing estate. So there's a lot of people over there who are on limited income, often don't have vehicles at all, are on foot, and are looking for value options. So those two customers are the ones we're specifically trying to look after. We also have concentrated on gifting. We have a gifting area in store. We sell a lot of hampers, which we make in store. Over 1,000 hampers last year we sold. It's a big part of our business. We sell a lot of boxed chocolates, balloons, greetings cards, those sorts of things, because actually there aren't many places you can buy those in our town.
Sure. So filling in the gaps where those services aren't available locally. You know, if you had a gift shop around the corner, you wouldn't be providing those services. Really interesting. So transient customer base, more local customer base.
They're not really, they're transient in that they're moving, but they are regulars.
Local people
so
who are coming to and from.
Yes, locally. So they are in and out all the time. 80 to 90% of our customers, we know them. And seeing that in the report was quite interesting. We're not the only ones in that case, but they are on the move, yes.
Sure. Interesting. So any reflections on the report, Rachel? Any things that you thought, that's actually one of them. That's me, I can recognise that. Or any things in the report where you said, actually, we're probably a bit different to the norm in terms of rural shops?
There were quite a lot of things that, did fit in with us. I was making notes as we went, actually. Our customer numbers have not returned to pre-pandemic level, but our basket spend is up, and we are probably 25% up on shop sales as opposed to pre-pandemic. So it's quite a large amount of money up, but customer numbers still quite aren't there yet. So that's very interesting that's also really what the report was saying. The services part of it, I can see, we have nearly all of the services that you were talking about, and we have invested heavily in technology, and I can see that in the other local shops surrounding us as well. The one thing where we differ is the home delivery section, which we've really quite struggled with home delivery. You're not the only one,
I can tell you that for sure.
And we've had 2 stabs at home delivery, one in the real heat of pandemic lockdown, when we were operating on mobile phones and taking things out to vulnerable people and not charging any delivery costs at all, and running ourselves, which frankly we were only able to do because our coffee shop was shut, because we have a coffee shop on site too, and the staff retrained and did all of that for us. Then we've tried again, we've invested quite heavily in technology. We're working with Henderson's in Northern Ireland for their EdgePOS system. We've taken on their Appetite app and went very high technology, and worked in conjunction with a local company that were delivering takeaways. But it didn't really work for us, to be honest. I mean, we think it will work in the future. We think locally our people aren't just quite ready for it yet. People who live in rural areas are much more organised about their food shopping, because they know they can't just walk down the road to get what they need. The villages surrounding us, a lot of them don't have any shops at all, and most delivery systems work on a 3-mile radius. If it was going to work for us, we'd have to be delivering up to 10 miles away to service those customers, and then it's a big expense to deliver that far, and you're having to charge for it, and you need a whole infrastructure to do it. And we're not quite there yet. Not just us, but locally, we're not quite there yet.
Yeah, it's fascinating insights on that. I think you're not on your own by any stretch of the imagination. I think everyone recognises there's a growth in demand around this, that a lot of customers are interested in delivery, that obviously we were able to play that role during the pandemic, and some retailers have made a big success of it since. But making the economics stack up is not straightforward.
It's very hard indeed.
Yeah. What other investments are you making in the business then? What are the sort of changes you're trying to bring through? I know you've got a lot of green investment in the business and elsewhere.
Yeah, we're trying. I mean, the big things that are coming for us in the future are electric charging points. We've had the planning permission for that for nearly 4 years, and trying the partner that we were involved with at the time, the cost of putting the new electricity in was so extreme. It was £35,000 that they pulled out. Now we found a new partner, and that's going ahead very soon. That should be in before the end of the financial year, which is good. But actually, electric cars are, you know, they're going to be big, and they already are in lots of areas. But there are so few places to charge in rural areas. In fact, I think Jeremy Clarkson used Lincoln as an example when he was doing something on Top Gear a long time ago. Even in Sleaford itself, the only electric charging points now are slow charge ones at Tesco, and they only went in last year. So we will be the only fast charge ones in town. So that, you know, is the big investment for us. We did quite a lot of investment in technology in 2019 when we had a big refit. I'm very grateful we did, because it put us in a good position when COVID hit. You know, we've gone to electronic shelf edge labels and things like that. But the next thing we're going to be looking at is solar panels, actually, because the electric costs are just frightening, absolutely frightening how much it's gone up. I mean, in the last year in our main building, we've used £28,000 of electricity. And my quote from the electricity company this week is, if we go on to a variable one, it's going to be 77,000. And if we want a fixed rate, it's going to be 100,000. So, you know, and we are completely reliant on electricity here, because we don't have mains gas in our in our area. Just like we don't have main sewage, you know, we're all on septic tanks. We don't have public transport really, even, you know, those things in a rural area we're dealing with all the time. We're going to have to also make some investments on our heating system, because we don't have mains gas. We actually run on a heating system that it operates with red diesel, and the duty relief that you've had is disappearing this year, so the costs there are going to double as well. So we may have to try and introduce something that's more eco-friendly and less expensive. That's another area of expense.
It's a really good point, and something that we've been picking up on a lot, is that of all the challenges retailers are facing at the moment, energy costs you mentioned, obviously prime among them, delivery and supply issues, because suppliers of all kinds are facing exactly the same issues. So costs are going up, and a real challenge. But all of those problems are kind of worse in a rural area, because you haven't got so many choices of other places to go, and things like you haven't got gas supply. You've only got one option, whereas maybe in some more built up areas you've got 2 or 3 options for either getting supply or getting power or whatever else it might be. So it's a really great example. What sort of things would you think the government could do to help rural shops? This whole agenda around levelling up, around supporting places, and what sort of things do you think the government could give a bit of a helping hand with?
I think being realistic about our rates bills, and the fact that rural rate relief is absolutely vital for us to have some of those things. I mean, petrol stations in particular are quite badly hit by their rates bills. Although I would like to say we have been looked after during the pandemic. So that,
they're about to come back on stream. So
they are, and I think it's very difficult when you're in a rural area. You won't have the volume of sales of some of your fuel products, but you still have to stock them and still have all of the expense of that. And there are so few petrol stations in rural areas now. Customers have to travel quite a long way to find one, and it's an essential service, and I think that we should be looked after for that. Also trying to introduce some of these energy saving things, if there were some ways that we could have some assistance with that. I mean, introducing solar panels and things, it's a big expense to have all at once. Now, we did in the past have used carbon trust loans, and I know things aren't quite the same as they used to be with that, but we actually had a carbon trust loan to put in LED lighting a few years ago, and that was fantastic because you could offset it against the cost of your electricity. any initiative like that is a big help to us. But to be honest, the other thing that we could do is not have such awful red tape and not so much legislation thrown at us at one time. Last autumn, we had so much to deal with all at one time. I mean, the introduction of E10, Natasha's Law, changes to the gambling rules, and an introduction of a VAT rate we haven't had before, all within the same week. And all of those things made huge changes to what we were doing and huge expense. And this year, apart from the electricity costs, the thing I'm most concerned about is the high fat, salt and sugar regulations, because unfortunately we fall into that category. Now we're only 2,100 square feet, but because we're a symbol retailer, you know, we're going to have to follow those, and I actually don't know how we're going to do it. And it will impact our business, particularly as hampers, which have lots of chocolate in, can't be displayed in primary areas, and that's one of our USPs. So those sorts of things I am concerned about, and the expense of coping with legislation and red tape, even things like GDPR and those sorts of things. It's a lot for a small retailer in a rural area to deal with. It's a lot for any retailer to deal with, but you know, the challenges that we face mean that we're trying to, as I said, be everything to everybody, which means when there's a legislation change, everything that happens you have to deal with.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great example, and sadly for you, you'll be caught by all aspects of the legislation, and therefore you'll physically have to move your store around. And I'm not sure that that's still fully widely understood, that the scale of the impact that's going to have come October. Rachel, we could chat all afternoon, but I'm afraid we're going to have to finish it there. Thank you so much for sharing your story and telling us about your business. Fantastic store and fantastic business, and I know you played an incredibly important role in that community in Sleaford. So thanks very much for your time today.
Thanks very much, James.
Now we're going to hear from a government minister, Lord Benyon, who's going to talk about the role of local shops and what government policy is doing to try to promote rural shops. So over to Lord Benyon.
Hello, and it's very good to be with you today. I'm Richard Benyon. I'm the Rural Affairs Minister. As somebody who lives in a rural community where there is a small village store, a convenience store, I know the importance that institutions like that have to the communities they support. And the work that is done is so much more than just being there as a retail outlet. It's part of people's lives, and it is enormously important for vulnerable people and those who've been affected so recently by the pandemic. And I'm delighted that today's launch of the Association of Convenience Stores Rural Shop Report, because this is so important to the work you're doing and the work that your members do to so many communities across rural England. As well, you know, the rural economy is incredibly diverse. While agriculture and tourism shape rural areas, the range of rural businesses is much broader. And there are many successful businesses that provide both high levels of employment and support vital supply chains. And this is clear from the report that finding that 48% of the workforce in rural shops have been employed for over 5 years. As I said earlier, rural shops have a vital role to play in sustaining their communities. I was really interested to read about the various ways they bring communities together, and I've experienced this myself. Rural shops facilitate a wide range of essential services, and 80% of independent retailers take part in community activities such as charity collections, funding, sponsorship and donations. This is commendable and is reflective of a real spirit that exists in rural communities. I mentioned the pandemic earlier, and I was pleased to read how many of the retailers have found their standing in the community is in fact improved, as if it couldn't improve further, but has improved as a result of what they've done to support people in this most difficult time. Communities are social entities and they need anchors, and in too many rural areas those anchors are no longer there, but the community store, the convenience store, the village shop is absolutely fundamental to people's lives, and I applaud the enormous contribution that rural shops make, and I also note the challenges of operating a business in the rural context. We are doing much here at DEFRA to improve digital connectivity, but I know that and having people with the right skills in the labour market is a challenge which we are determined to address. And we're committed to understanding the challenges and for me to work across government. This is not just a DEFRA issue, it's one that we want to do to support all small and medium-sized businesses in rural areas. This department, DEFRA, leads on rural affairs across government, but the work of all departments has an impact on rural areas. Whether we live in a city, a town, or a remote rural setting, we all expect the same opportunities and protections. The government is about to publish its Levelling Up white paper. Levelling up should also mean levelling out from the towns and cities into the communities where people's existence can sometimes find that the difficulties they face are exacerbated by rurality. And we want to make sure there is a new policy regime which will be in place and drive policies support out into those communities in a way that hasn't happened enough in recent decades. So I see myself as a champion of rural areas within government. I'm supported by a great team of officials here at DEFRA, and we will continue to strive to ensure that rural interests are always taken into account across government business. Our first rural proofing report, published last March, set out the government's priorities for rural areas, and it illustrated how rural proofing can make a difference and how we plan to coordinate it across government. So I look forward to publishing the next report in the reasonably near future. So my congratulations again on the publication of this report. I'm always happy to hear from the ACS. I want to make sure that we work together to ensure that rural shops prosper and that they have a strong and sustainable future protecting and supporting our rural communities. Thank you for all you do, and thank you to your members for all they do for rural communities. It is the glue that keeps our communities together. I'm enormously appreciative of their efforts, and I wish you well for the future.
Richard, thank you very much indeed. Fantastic message. Many things I'm sure we're all very, very pleased to hear. I love levelling out. I think that's a phrase you ought to be using more, because there's a risk in maybe thinking of things that agenda about regionally, but actually moving out from the cities and levelling up in rural areas, levelling up on the edge of those cities actually as well. Very, very important. So a great phrase that we're going to try and commandeer a bit, I suspect, over the next few months. So it just falls to me to sum up. I just want to say a couple of things. I'll try and get it in the minute we've got before the close of the event. The first is, let's not be under any illusions. This is a tough time actually for rural shops, and we touched on it with Rachel a little bit with Selaine as well. Some of the challenges that retailers are facing with the costs of supply of goods into their business, and the costs in their own businesses, energy costs, Rachel talked about there, the costs of employing people in the business as well. And so how to manage those costs in the context of having customers who are themselves worried about their cost of living and feel squeezed. So that puts our members and puts rural shops in particular in a very constrained position in managing their economics over the next few months and possibly beyond that. And we think that rural shops find that position particularly difficult because they're less likely to have choice of 3, 4, 5 different suppliers, or they're less likely to be able to move around their energy supplier, or less likely to find such a large pool of potential colleagues to work in their business. Just that remoteness by comparison to their urban counterparts means that all of those issues are that much tougher for rural stores. So there's a concern about how this is going to play out, and we need help from government through these quite choppy times as the world economy and the UK economy adjust to coming out of the pandemic. But the Rural Shop report, I think, shows as clearly as you could possibly hope that rural shops are relevant. You know, it's not some antiquated image, it's not a message or a feature of the past. It is very much a feature of the future. Rural shops are definitely here to stay. We have to navigate some rocky times in the short term, but we're more relevant than ever to our communities. And I think what's great about today is hearing the engagement from politicians. And I know a number of MPs and their officers are on the call here today. So thank you very much for giving the time to look at this report. But there's a lot of interest and a real will, I think, across the political spectrum for supporting these rural shops. So our job is to explain how we can do that in the most effective way and work with those parliamentarians and work with you, our members, retailers, suppliers to the industry to make sure we have a healthy and thriving rural shop sector. Thank you all very much for taking part in this webinar. I think I have one or two issues with the link for the report. We'll make sure that everyone gets a copy of the report. Get in touch with us if you need a copy. And again, thanks very much for everyone who's taken part.